Hello, and welcome to the First Right Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. Be sure to find our work at restoration-news.com. Joining us today is John Nantz, a retired FBI agent and conservative columnist specializing in national security and also tracking how America is becoming a police state under the radical left. John, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about your background in law enforcement. When you served with the FBI, it was still America's premier agency for stopping actual criminals, the real bad guys. But today, it increasingly seems like the FBI is more of a tool for hunting down the Democratic Party's political enemies. Or am I exaggerating?
No, you're not exaggerating at all. In fact, the FBI is part of the problem. It's a leadership problem that extends all the way up to Director Wray, but more broadly, it's a problem with DOJ and the Attorney General. I don't think most people realize that the FBI director's immediate boss is the Attorney General. So if you have someone like Merrick Garland, who, is really in the back pocket of Joe Biden, it's very difficult for the FBI director to push back. That's not to say that he shouldn't. In fact, if you had a principled, committed FBI director, you would have more of that pushback. In fact, there was some pushback on the Mar-a-Lago raid at a much lower level, at a assistant director in charge level out of the Washington field office. But that pushback was ignored, and the Attorney General's wishes were followed. And so you had a lot of that ham-handedness that went on at the Mar-a-Lago raid.
Now, obviously, this politicization of the Justice Department and the FBI, it's been going on for at least a decade now. And we've increasingly seen how corrupt these agencies are at the very top, where politics has its way with these old institutions. But in your experience, you've been in law enforcement for, 2.5 decades now. When did the corruption really begin?
The Bureau has had a checkered history really since its inception in the early 20th century. But the more modern, the more contemporary problems really occurred under the Obama administration. Well, and even before that, some of the groundwork was laid during the Bush administration. In fact, 9/11 had a tremendous impact upon the FBI, upon Director Mueller in particular. And after 9/11, we really began to see the push to emphasize intelligence collection. And a lot of that occurred because Bush essentially asked Mueller, why did this happen? And this can't happen again. And Mueller's response was to kind of re-gear the FBI toward that intelligence collection model and away from the criminal prosecutions or that criminal mindset that had been in place. But the weaponization that we're seeing today is really a direct result of the Obama administration of James Comey. In fact, I remember very clearly I was still an agent when Comey gave that now infamous press conference where he exonerated Hillary Clinton. In fact, he was going through a laundry list of things, violations of law, of policy, that if an FBI employee had committed those same violations, and Comey pretty much admitted that FBI employee would be fired, would lose their security clearance, and probably would be the subject of a counterintelligence investigation. So a lot of what we're seeing today is the result of Obama administration emphases on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has changed the FBI culture quite a bit. I saw a lot more of that toward the end of my career. I didn't really have to deal with that directly much. But what we're seeing today with what Biden is doing in terms of weaponizing the DOJ, in terms of weaponizing the FBI is really sort of an Obama legacy or a continuation of what Obama began during his administration.
Well, John, you do raise an interesting point. A lot of the tools that we see employed against Trump supporters and conservatives and people associated with the Tea Party since 2010 were actually innovations from the 20th century that the FBI used to go after, well, first anarchists in the early 20th century, but later Nazis and communists working for the Soviet Union. And I think a lot of conservatives these days may have supported those measures. I mean, I certainly would have if I was around at the time. But I think we're coming to regret that support. It seems like most of the innovation that happened under Obama was simply turning those tools against American patriots, people who fly Betsy Ross flags rather than those who fly Soviet flags. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think you're probably referring to the Patriot Act. Is that kind of what you're referring to?
I think that's a big turning point. Yes.
Yeah. Some elements of the Patriot Act, have been useful. A lot of the abuses have come in the expansion of the FISA process, which essentially is secret warrants obtained in a classified setting in a secret court. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line of what really takes place. If we could go back to the original implementation of FISA, which is a warrant seeking process, and it's a criminal process, and that was focused on foreign actors, which is the F in FISA stands for foreign, for the foreign emphasis of that legislation. So, but the problem that we have seen with the Patriot Act is that this 3-hop rule has been put into place, where if you have an individual, let's say you have a person of foreign citizenship that makes a phone call, and that phone call can be leaked or linked rather to a U.S. person, that U.S. person and 2 other hops, so to speak, in their phone records can also be accessed. And it's gotten worse than that. NSA is involved in some of this. I think part of the Patriot Act authorizes the Bureau to use NSA data, which if you're not familiar with the National Security Agency, they're like a giant vacuum cleaner. So anything digital, anything in it, and that's not an exaggeration, anything digital, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, if it's got ones and zeros, the NSA has the capability of collecting it. They do collect it, and they do store that data. And originally the idea was, well, law enforcement, or the FBI in particular, will only have access to that data as needed. But the problem is when does the government ever limit its own power? It really doesn't. If it has the opportunity to exceed the bounds of legislative authority or policy, it tends to do so.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the FISA legislation, which is many decades old at this point, was created in response to the Bureau wiretapping Americans without their consent. And I think the idea behind that, if I'm correct in this, was at least let's have some kind of regulation in here so that we can actually surveil, agents of foreign governments like the Soviet Union, or I guess China these days. But clearly, if that's the case, the spirit of the law is being violated here when they're going after law-abiding American citizens who are not, in fact, agents of a foreign country, no matter whether the left says so or not, right?
Yeah, of course. I'm one of the people that I do think FISA is still a legitimate. It's still a legitimate piece of legislation, and it's still valuable to our national security. I think Title VII, if I'm correct, there's part of FISA that essentially pulls it out of that foreign intelligence collection model and creates a lot of the opportunity for the abuse that we see today. So if we could remove that particular section involved in FISA, I think that we would be much happier as citizens, and our civil liberties would be much more secure. But I do think that FISA is a good tool. It's just that the Bureau needs to dial back the way that it implements FISA in particular.
Now, we've seen that the politicization of both the Justice Department and the FBI, at least at the very top echelons, of course, where the president makes his own political selections. But in your experience, is it true what they say that, well, there's a really big distinction between those career politicians, the James Comey types, and your everyday FBI agent? Or really, do you see that kind of, in the DEI years that we live in, do you see that kind of corruption really running from top to bottom?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think we're at the point where we have corruption running, completely from top to bottom. DEI or Biden's DEIA policies are incredibly detrimental. And it's not just an FBI problem. It's a DOD problem. It's a CIA problem. This policy has been mandated throughout the federal government. So Andrew Breitbart said something very, very wise. He said that politics is downstream of culture. That's very, very true.
That's right.
And it's not just politics that's downstream of culture. It's our four-letter agents, or our three-letter agencies, rather. They're all downstream of culture, and we tend to forget that. So people don't really think about, well, where does the FBI draw their workforce from? And that's from the American people. So if you have our institutions of higher learning that have been compromised by Marxists, as they have been in large part, then the kids of today are our FBI agents of tomorrow, or our CIA agents of tomorrow. So there is a big social element that's involved as well, outside of the DEIA problem. But what DEIA does is it plain and simple is sort of a repackaging of racial quotas, and people will debate that. But you can go onto the FBI website and you can see that statistics are collected and maintained, and so that is simply a quota system. We ought to be selecting people, well, regardless of whether it's a government job or in the private sector, based on merit, not on an immutable characteristic like skin color or a person's sex.
I do think with DEI, it obviously is kind of a successor program to affirmative action, but there really is a political correctness angle to many of the DEI hires. They're not simply hiring Black women because they're Black and female. There is a compliance to, you will advance the left's woke agenda here. You will not be a hindrance to it. And you raise a good point. I mean, we've seen elsewhere that so many young people don't want to become law enforcement or police officers because of the way that the whole justice system has been turned against our police. And of course, that's the ranks from which the FBI hires many of its agents, right? So we're looking downstream with this generational problem of where are we going to have future law enforcement officers who really aren't just, well, let's just call them DEI subjects of the state or servants of the state, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big problem, and I don't think there's a simple solution for it. I mean, DEI can be revoked in a day. I mean, if we're fortunate enough, in my opinion, to have a Trump presidency, he can remand those DEIA policies by the stroke of a pen. But the problem is we have people that are in the system that are very much indoctrinated and are very much part of woke culture. In fact, there's a supervisory special agent just came forward, I think, maybe a week or so ago, I think the House Judiciary, and has said essentially that the security division, or as we call it, SecD, is involved in weeding people out based on their political allegiances.
Wow.
I think they've even alleged that some of the forms, some of the interview forms that are used, they're asking people pointedly, do you support Trump? What is your view of January 6th? That type of thing, which is completely inappropriate. So right now we do have we have a big leadership problem. I think it's primarily a leadership problem. The FBI is a top-down organization in its structure and in its culture. It is very paramilitary in the sense that there is a very definite chain of command, that type of thing. So if you have an attorney general who is a constitutionalist, if you have an FBI director that has a mandate to change the culture, to return the Bureau to its criminal roots, then we will see change. We can see meaningful change, meaningful cultural change at the FBI. A lot of the things that are most prominent in the news, like the Mar-a-Lago raid, like the Roger Stone arrest, these types of things simply would not occur if you had an FBI director that is willing to push back, or an attorney general who is not simply going to just do what the commander in chief tells him to do. Somebody who actually is concerned about civil liberties, concerned about due process, and preserving our national institutions.
So there's more and more evidence, and I mentioned this in the intro, that the United States is descending into a police state, right? I mean, if you'll recall, Dinesh D'Souza has a recent documentary out on this exact topic. Two headlines that people might not be familiar with, or in some cases would be. In January, we learned that FBI agents had helped an autistic 16-year-old American citizen plan a trip to the Middle East so he could join ISIS, and then waited till he turned 18 so they could promptly arrest him on terrorism charges. A couple years ago, people remember in Michigan, the whole fabricated scheme by FBI agents to kidnap the Michigan Democrat governor, Gretchen Whitmer, there so they could pin it on so-called white supremacist militia members, which was absolutely not true at all. These are just two cases where we see obvious entrapment or outright fabrication by Bureau agents in order to go after, well, in the one case, people that we would obviously disagree with, heinous people. Nevertheless, they are U.S. citizens who are having their rights deprived here. John, is this evidence that we are living in a police state, or am I putting it too strongly?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we're living in a police state. I think we do have instances where the FBI, not just the FBI, but other federal agencies are overreaching. They're violating their own policy, just in an attempt to perhaps bolster statistics, that they can take to Congress and say, look, we're doing this kind of work, and so we need this kind of funding. Unfortunately, and it's, again, I hate to be repetitive, but it's not just an FBI problem. It's a problem when you have leadership that feels like they need to pander to Congress to justify a specific budget. And sometimes
I understand that, but let me challenge you a little bit on that. We saw during the 2020 Summer of Love how the FBI and local law enforcement basically completely ignored all the Antifa and Black Lives Matter rioters. If they're simply trying to show, hey, we arrest the bad guys on both sides of the aisle in order to justify a ballooning budget or whatever, that I think we expect to see them go after those types. But we see it completely one-sided, and it only seems to benefit the Biden regime or the Democratic Party's political interests. And wouldn't you say that's at least pushing us in the direction of some kind of, police state situation, or call it whatever you like, something authoritarian like that?
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that we're not heading in that direction. I was simply just trying to make the point that sometimes that's why that happens. Now, in terms of what happened during the Summer of Love and the January 6th investigation, I was still a Bureau employee during all that. And it was very, very obvious to me and to many of my coworkers that the resources that were allocated to investigate what happened during the summer of mostly peaceful protests was in no way in line with the massive amount of resources that was dedicated to the January 6th investigation. So there was a huge disparity there, and it's very, very obvious to anybody who was involved in either investigations. There were arrests made during during that summer where you had Antifa and BLM rioting, but nothing compared to the amount of resources dedicated. In fact, at Washington field office, 3 brand new squads were stood up just to deal with the J6 information.
Wow.
And the Bureau was collecting massive amounts of information, you name it, body cam videos from local law enforcement, video at the Capitol, video that people were sending in from their iPhones or their smartphones, just a huge database of video and other information. So I don't think I wouldn't call what we're living in right now a police state. Are we moving in that direction? Absolutely. Are the Democrats responsible for that? 100%. And that's why I'm a big advocate of a Trump presidency. I'm hoping to see some real accountability. I think Trump has a very balanced position with regard to the FBI and the intelligence community as a whole, which is very interesting because he's been the victim of, much of this government weaponization, but he still understands the importance to national security of many of these organizations, to include the FBI.
Does the FBI leadership or the rank and file agents really believe that January 6th was an attempted insurrection to overthrow the government of the United States?
No. Well, I can't speak for executive management. My guess, I mean, from what I've observed, from what we've all observed, is that executive management is on board with that narrative that J6 was an insurrection. But I can tell you emphatically, because I was running a squad at the time, that to a person on the squad that I dealt with and on squads that I had contact with, no one viewed it as an insurrection. The perspective at the field office at the time was the individuals that were involved in committing criminal acts like breaking down doors, smashing in windows, things like that, they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But people that just walked into the building and were essentially taking a tour, I mean,
yes, right.
Maybe there's an argument. DOJ makes the argument, well, that they were trespassing. There's a federal trespassing statute, but we've never seen the kind of prosecutorial overreach and, frankly, persecution that has occurred with regard to people who simply were walking into the building.
Well, obviously the federal government has plans to deal with all sorts of contingencies, among them an actual armed revolution against the U.S. government. And it certainly seems in retrospect that even with all of the political considerations that would benefit the Democrats, many people in Washington leaped at the idea of, oh, finally, we get to dust off these old white papers because there actually is an armed insurrection here. I mean, talk about a classic overreaction, right? I mean, have you seen people's views on that change in the last 3.5 years since then, though?
Well, what do you mean FBI employees, or do you
I think
mean
within Washington and the national security establishment?
Well, it's such a politicized issue. I mean, you really can divide people based on their party affiliation. I mean, Democrats will hammer all day long the insurrection narrative. Republicans tend not to do that. I don't know if I've seen a or have perceived a shift necessarily. I think it still runs along party lines. I don't think that people who were conservatives before January 6th have a different view today. I don't think that people who are Democrats or who are more left leaning have changed their minds with regard to January 6th.
Yes.
You know, despite all that what we see in the media or what Biden has to say or any other politician has to say, it's very easy if you see the video, if you see what occurred. I mean, you use the phrase armed insurrection. Well, it's kind of hard to have an armed insurrection when nobody has a firearm. So, you know,
one would think.
One would think. But we all know that these people are playing politics. You know, the January 6th Commission was a complete farce. Every person on that panel was a partisan. And I think common sense people, I think the average American, they look at that and they understand that politics is being played. And but the real tragedy is the way our justice system has been abused, and how we have scores of people who are sitting in prison in D.C. today for essentially doing nothing more than trespassing on federal property.
Switching gears here a little bit, I'm interested in your take on the killing of Brian Malinowski recently. So back in, I believe it was March, for the people who aren't familiar with this story, Mr. Malinowski was the executive director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton Airport in Little Rock, Arkansas. He also happened to be a very avid gun owner, not a crime, though he did collect many, many guns, I think in the hundreds. And that got him landed on the ATF suspicion list. Well, his home was raided around 6 a.m. Officers from the ATF knocked on his door and gave him, I believe the number was exactly 28 seconds to get up, get out of bed, get downstairs, open the front door before they banged it down. Mr. Malinowski, of course, probably thought it was a break-in, so he pulled a weapon on officers and they shot him dead. I believe he died at the hospital. You know, this strikes many people, myself included, as not just a poor mistake of judgment, but maybe perhaps going so far as to call it a planned assassination of a gun owner. I realize that's a strong way of putting it. But what I mean is this was a man who was no threat to law enforcement. He was a decent, upstanding American citizen, a very public figure. They could have arrived at his door any time of the day, armed or not, instead of treating it like a raid on Osama bin Laden's compound here. Mm-hmm. And I think many people will look at that and conclude that, well, this is an overt attempt by the left to scare American citizens into exercising their Second Amendment rights. I mean, do you think this is becoming more and more common, or is this just an out of the blue blip on the radar?
Well, it's really hard to kind of armchair quarterback situations like that. I was in local law enforcement before the FBI. I was a deputy sheriff for 6.5 years. And it is very, very difficult to, unless you have all the facts, unless you understand exactly what happened on the ground, it's hard to make a judgment with regard to people's actions. Now, could that theoretically have been handled better? Well, I think so. I think that's pretty obvious. You know, anytime a tragedy like that occurs, I mean, we loosely have the facts. You know, the ATF arrives, you know, and typically when you're serving a search warrant, if it's a SWAT type of an operation, you do arrive very early in the morning, simply because people are usually asleep at that time, and they're far less likely to engage in violence at those very, very early hours in the morning. But does that present other risks? You know, even though they knocked and announced, if those are actually the facts, I'm not super familiar with all the facts in that particular incident. You know, but the fact that, you know, did he not recognize them? You know, I kind of find that hard to believe. If they're if they're engaged in a search warrant and they're wearing tactical gear, then it's very obvious that they're law enforcement, or at least that should have been very, very obvious by what they're wearing. Do I think it is the government's attempt to dissuade people from keeping and bearing arms? I don't know if I would go that far. It's hard to parse that particular incident out and give you an accurate assessment of it, because there are so many factors involved. And I'm not trying to make an excuse for what ATF did. I'm no fan of ATF, nor am I a fan of the IRS either. But you know, like I said, it's very difficult to armchair quarterback those particular cases unless you have all the information that the people on the ground at the time had. So I think that's the best answer I can give you.
Let's talk about what you've written about the FBI targeting faithful Roman Catholics. You've called the FBI in this situation a grand inquisitor, obviously hearkening back to the late medieval Inquisition here, but this time targeting what the left calls radical traditionalist Roman Catholic theology, which of course is just traditional Catholic theology pre-Vatican II in the 1960s here. I actually happen to live just outside Richmond, Virginia, where this is kind of centered on here. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, I've written several pieces about it, and it's been very interesting that recently some additional information has come to light. I wrote a Substack piece on it that goes into great detail. The documents that were originally released were heavily redacted. They were not redacted by the FBI. I don't know where the documents came from specifically. We know they came out of the Richmond field office. The document is actually called a domain perspective. So it's not really a memo. It is an intelligence product. The intended office or the intended audience are executive management level individuals. So this kind of a document is intended to give executive management an idea of where the threats may or may not be in their particular area of operation. The anti-Catholic memo, as it's come to be known, was really predicated on a domestic terrorism investigation involving one particular individual. Two other individuals also were involved. The individual that was the predicate for this intelligence product was actually arrested sometime before the intelligence product was actually produced. So, number one, was it poorly written and incredibly poorly sourced? Yes, 100%. However, is it an indication that the FBI is investigating Catholics? No, it is not. Is it an indication that the FBI is looking at Catholic parishes, is going forward and interviewing priests or members of church or Catholic parishes? Yes, the FBI does that. The larger question is that inappropriate? Well, it's not really inappropriate for an agent to go speak to someone. The details of this particular document, when the unredacted portions, and this is a big point I want to stress, the redactions were not made by the Bureau. They were made by the individual who leaked the document or by the individual who released the document to Uncover DC, which was the online publication that first produced those documents or presented those documents to the public. There has been subsequent reporting with regard to a far less redacted version, which was actually produced by the FBI and delivered to the House Judiciary Committee. All this stuff is documented in my Substack piece. You can go and you can compare the documents that were originally released to the documents that were given or the copies of the documents that were given to House Judiciary. And when you look at both sets of documents that were released, it becomes very apparent that the information that most mitigates the idea that the FBI is going after Roman Catholics, that stuff was redacted. So to me, it makes me highly suspicious about the motivation of the individuals involved who originally released that document. So, and there's another misconception that I kind of would like to clear up if I can.
Yes.
There's a footnote in the Catholic memo, if we're going to call it that, that specifically talks about individuals who participate in the traditional Latin Mass, if I have that correct. Mm-hmm. The FBI, even in that document, what the analysts were saying, not in a very clear way, was that individuals who practice the traditional Latin Mass are not the individuals that the Bureau is looking for. The FBI was actually investigating an individual who had demonstrated violent tendencies, who was in fact arrested and convicted on those charges, who was trying to insert himself into I think it was actually a priestly order. I'm not a Roman Catholic, so I'm not 100% familiar with the precise structure. But what they were trying to do was protect the Catholic practitioners from this radicalized and violent individual. Was that presented in the document very clearly? No, it was not. And people were rightly very, very concerned about the document sourcing information from the name escapes me at the moment. Southern Poverty Law Center.
Right.
That's probably one of the worst sources that you could go to for information. It's certainly very, very biased information. So the bottom line go ahead.
I understand what you're saying, and it is good to know it's not as bad as it seems at first blush, but doesn't it strike you as extremely suspicious that this fact pattern of you have the left trying to politicize traditional conservatives, and it seems to me, based on what you said, this document suggests that the FBI considers traditional conservative Catholic parishes to be a kind of breeding ground for domestic terrorists. I mean, this one individual aside, am I reading too much into that, or are we seeing some kind of sinister fact pattern that goes back to the SPLC and the left?
The bigger overarching issue is that we have an FBI that is politicized, that is being weaponized. Okay, so it makes it very, very easy to take a document like that and I don't blame the American public at all in assuming the worst. In fact, the FBI has really blown all its credibility with the American public. So I don't fault the American public for jumping to, well, they're not even jumping to the wrong conclusion, because as the document was originally presented, it looked just like you're saying, like the FBI is targeting Catholics who participate in the traditional Roman Mass, which is not at all what the document says. Is the Bureau involved in, or does the Bureau have the perspective that the Roman Catholic Church is a breeding ground for radical domestic extremists? Based on that document, I'd say no. In fact, I think the document in its less redacted form actually makes the opposite argument, that the FBI is actually trying to protect the Roman Catholic Church, its parishes, from radicalized individuals, because as the document is written, that individual is already determined to be radical and very racist. And again, my Substack piece goes into great detail about all those particular questions. But do Americans need to be concerned about the FBI encroaching upon their civil liberties? I'd say, yeah, well, yes. I'd say insofar as they should be concerned about the government, broadly speaking, encroaching upon their religious liberties, their civil liberties, their Second Amendment rights, especially when our government is in the hands of woke, liberal radicals. Yes, you should be very concerned. Is the FBI currently a part of that? Well, yes, to some degree, it certainly is. Just like the CIA, was involved in trying to delegitimize the Russiagate information, the Russiagate scandal, or Hunter Biden's laptop, or all the rest of it. We should be extremely concerned. It used to be a very patriotic thing to question your government, and
yes,
and today it's that seems to have been turned on its head. Like, if you're a patriot, you don't question the government.
Yeah, and it might be a blessing in disguise for the conservative right to discover that. We didn't always have the best track record in the 20th century of questioning these kinds of police intervention in American civil liberties. But I think we've learned the hard way. Maybe I don't want to overstate this, but I think many of us have learned the hard way about how important it is to not give the government that much power. John, as we close out here, you have mentioned a number of times that obviously electing President Trump in November 2024 is going to go a long way towards solving these things. What other solutions should we be on the lookout for? What does Congress need to do, for instance?
Well, Congress needs to step up to the plate for a change, frankly. I mean, how long have we had a Republican majority in Congress? And it seems like nothing really is accomplished. I mean, if we can take back the White House, and if we can have a Congress that is committed to action, to real action, to government transparency, then we can see a lot of these things rolled back. But this is a very large problem. It is beyond government, frankly. It's a societal problem. We've allowed cultural Marxists, as we kind of talked about a little bit before, to insert themselves into our institutions of higher learning, into Hollywood, you name it. Even the permanent Washington. We've allowed this, so they've made great headway into the things that are important and create our culture. So this is a problem that I think that needs to be addressed by the church, by individuals at the local level. I think it's extremely important for people to be involved at the local level. But I think that making a big dent in this problem is going to be reclaiming the White House, making sure we have individuals in Congress who are committed to actually accomplishing things and creating greater government transparency.
I think you're right. Maybe one of the great lessons from our time is that when you trade away your liberty for security, you end up with neither. Maybe we understood this better at one point, but I think we are going to understand it better. John Nantz, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And let me thank you folks for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like John's, working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.